Hi, this is your professor, Judy Paparozzi. Welcome to Organized Crime. Sorry I didn't do a first day video, but you had enough to do with watching The Godfather, so I thought I'd do one for Chapter 3, which is something I think is very important. But I first want to thank you for your incredible work. You guys are awesome. I can't believe you're keeping up. I know you're working into the night, trying to keep up. We're on Chapter 3 today, which is Wednesday, May 13th, what happens to be Dr. Mario Paparozzi's and my 31st wedding anniversary. So we're going to have an Italian meal later on, even though I'm an Irish girl with an Italian last name and Italian citizenship. But I want to thank you. You did a great job on The Godfather. You guys knew that movie so well, those movies, as well as your in-depth analysis of Kuklinski. You really took those theories, especially the antisocial personality theory, and applied it well to this guy. So anyways, good start. Great start to a great class. The reason I picked Organized Crime is because you have to read a textbook, but it's an interesting textbook. It's not, the chapter 2 of all of them is the one that's kind of like you have to learn some theories, but the rest of it is just factual, and so it reads like a novel. So if you can sit on the beach now and read a novel, or sit at the lake or whatever, or sit in a park, this is a great novel to read for your Maymester. So today we're on Chapter 3, and I want to talk briefly about that. I posted the 5 families of New York and what they all look like today, and I also gave you an overview of what the prototype of organized crime in terms of an organization, and that is either the mafia or the camorra if you're in Naples, or the 'ndrangheta if you're in Calabria, Italy, or if you're in Sicily, la Cosa Nostra, which doesn't mean this thing of ours, it means our thing, because la is the word the, so it means Cosa Nostra means our thing. And so you're going to get a history of that, the Gabalotti, which you had already seen, and the Cascas that were created in Chapter 1. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly, give you a great overview of the mafia in America. So originally you had the Black Hand, the Mano Nero, and the Black Hand, basically, Mano Nera, the Black Hand was basically just guys like that you saw Don Fanucci in Godfather 2. They would just abuse their fellow Italians who were also poor, and they would extort from businesses and extort from families and so forth. And you saw that with Don Fanucci. And but that existed. The Black Hand existed all over the United States, and not just in places that you may be more familiar with, like New York City. But it was also in New Orleans, and it was in different parts of the country. Somebody was just very lazy and very selfish and big, like Don Fanucci, and he was described as being this big guy and very intimidating and so forth. But the Black Hand existed in many parts of the country. But then they got organized, and the 2 men in New York that got them organized were Masseria and Maranzano. Okay, so there were 2 bosses that were running organized crime in New York City specifically. But they fought a lot, and fighting is not good for business. And both of them had Lucky Luciano. His name was Charles Luciano, and actually in Italian you say Luciano, like Luciano Pavarotti. So Lucky Luciano worked for both of them and realized that this fighting was not working out. And so these 2 bosses were fighting so much, it actually had a name. And it was basically referring to some place in Italy where one of them came from, and it was basically the Castelmarese War, and that was between Masseria and Maranzano. Okay, and Luciano, meaning Lucky Luciano, was looking at this and saying, "This is no good." So he decided, well, what's the best thing if something's not good for business? You get rid of the 2 at the top. And because the problem was, not only were they fighting, but they were affecting the business, which, of course, this is all terrible stuff. This is all evil stuff. So the Castelmarese Wars were between the 2 original bosses, and one of them considered himself the big boss. I don't remember if it was Masseria or Maranzano, but they both considered themselves the capi di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. And Luciano, Lucky Luciano, realized that that's not the best way to conduct business. So he decided to get rid of both of them, and both of them were killed. When that happened, they realized that the most dangerous person is the one who earns the most respect, and that was Lucky Luciano. And Luciano decided he would recreate it, basically following what they did in Roman times when they had the Praetorian Guards. So there would be a a kind of a head, but he would be part of what they called the commission. So Luciano put the groups together that were all warring and said, we're all going to be, you can have your own families, but we're all going to be part of a commission, and we'll decide who gets knocked off, for lack of a better word. Any kind of business that you're going into, you'd have to go to the commission and say, this is what I'm proposing to do. And so the commission was established. Now, if you have a law, you need an enforcement for that law. The commission was now setting up laws for what would eventually become the 5 families. And so the commission decided we'd have to have an enforcement arm, and that was called Murder, Inc., Murder Incorporated. And the members of that were interesting because there were 2 Jewish guys and 2 Italian guys. Albert Anastasia, who was Italian, obviously. Bugsy Siegel, who was eventually would go to Hollywood, and he started Las Vegas. It was also Abe Rellis, and I'm just forgetting who the 4th guy was. But the Murder Incorporated was the enforcement arm, and of course, oh, I know it was not Frank Costello. It just went in and out of my head, but not important. So Murder Incorporated was the enforcement arms. So out of that, Vito Genovese. So out of that, it created the commission and had its enforcement arm, Murder Inc. And then the families were allowed to be established. So there was Carlo Gambino's family, so the Gambino family, the Joe Colombo family, the Vito Genovese family, the Lucchese family, and the Bonanno family. So those 5 families were allowed to be created, and then within those 5 families you have that pyramid with a boss at the top with an underboss, and then spreading out the capo di regime, the boss of the regime, each regime, which is like, Tessios and Clemenza if you use The Godfather. That's why I like The Godfather so much. And then, of course, you have the soldiers. And the whole idea of having a pyramid was the buffers, as you heard Chichi say, whatever his first name was, Chichi, when he was testifying in front of Congress. The soldiers buffered the capos buffered the underboss protected the boss. And of course there was a consigliere, which is a counselor in Italian, not an advocate, like a lawyer's an avvocata in my case, which is not an avocado, but it's a lawyer, okay, an advocate. A consigliere is kind of a counselor. So those 5 families were allowed to develop. And in this semester I'm going to ask you, who was the greatest Don of all time? Not that I love this stuff, I love talking about it, but I still think all these men did were evil. But is it Vito Genovese? Was it Lucky Luciano? Lucky went to prison for prostitution because a very famous prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was appointed to rout out organized crime. And Thomas Dewey eventually ran for president against Harry Truman and lost, although the country thought he was going to win. But Harry Truman first targeted Dutch Schultz, who was killed by the mob in New York, in Newark, because Dutch Schultz wanted to kill Thomas Dewey. And Lucky Luciano, by the way, the reason his nickname is Lucky and they don't go by Charles, is because he was attacked by either Joe Massaria's men or Maranzano's men, knowing that Lucky Luciano was planning to kill the 2 capo di capi, the 2 boss of the bosses at the beginning in that Castellamarese war, and they beat him within an inch of his life, and yet he still lived. So he was considered lucky, and he liked that nickname. But he had a real problem with prostitutes. He organized every brothel under the mob, and those girls then turned on him, and he went to prison and did his stuff in prison. So that's basically an organization, but I want to tell you a little bit more about Lucky Luciano. During World War II, and I've heard this story many times, many versions of the story, but during World War II, whether people know it or not, even here in North Carolina, the Germans had spies. And the Germans had a lot of spies on the docks in New York City, and one night they burned down a ship. These spies burned down one of our cargo ships to bring supplies to the troops in Europe, in the European theater of World War II, not the Pacific theater, but in the European theater. So the federal authorities, including Thomas Dewey, reached out to Lucky Luciano and said, can you get rid of these German spies on the New York docks? Because we're getting these troop ships in, their troop ships are going out, supply ships, and they're sabotaging our work. Well, do you know what? That the mob got rid of that problem in a matter of days, thanks to Lucky Luciano. So he also did another favor for, which you'll read about or see in some of these videos. He also did another favor for the federal government by getting Lepke Buckwalter, one of the 4 guys in the Murder Incorporated, to surrender, and he was executed. So the mob members did turn on each other. But anyway, that's a good summary of what you're going to be reading in chapter 4. I know there's the Chicago outfit and Al Capone. I know that there's the Jamie Bulger in Chicago, in Boston, who eventually went to prison. But I'm still using the mafia to show you how originally the organized crimes family were setting up. Sorry this video was so long, but I enjoy doing it a lot. See you in class.